I never thought the last words my son would say to me would be, "Dad, I'm scared." It was a gray Thursday morning in Portland. The kind that made the air smell like wet asphalt and old coffee. Ethan sat in the passenger seat beside me, his backpack slung over his chest instead of his shoulders. His hair still messy from the rush to school. He was 10. Smart. Curious. The kind of kid who asked too many questions about how car engines worked and why people lied. I remember telling him to buckle up, that we'd be late if he didn't hurry. He grinned and rolled his eyes like he always did. Lisa had left early for work, barely saying goodbye. Things between us had been tense for months. She said I worked too much, that I didn't listen, that I'd lost touch with our family. I told her I was doing my best. But even I didn't believe it anymore. Still, that morning, when Ethan waved from the doorway and said, "Love you, Mom," she smiled. It was small, tired, but it was a smile. The rain started just as we turned onto the main road. The wipers squeaked across the windshield in that annoying rhythm that made Ethan laugh. He started humming along with it. I smiled, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Then, out of nowhere, the car ahead of us braked hard. I slammed my foot on the brake. The pedal sank, soft and wrong, like stepping on wet clay. The car didn't slow. My heart jumped. I pumped it again, nothing. "Dad," Ethan's voice cracked. "Hold on," I shouted. We hit the back of the SUV in front of us, metal crunching like bones snapping. The airbag exploded in my face, burning my arms, filling my lungs with the smell of chemicals and panic. My head rang. For a second, all I could hear was static. Then, silence. Ethan. No answer. I turned. The passenger side was crumpled inward. The window shattered. He was slumped against the seatbelt, motionless, his face pale and still. My hands shook as I tried to reach him. "Ethan. Buddy. Wake up. Come on. Wake up." People were shouting outside. Someone was calling 911. I could barely breathe. I touched his cheek. It was warm but too still. When the ambulance came, I ran beside the gurney until the paramedic pushed me back. "Sir, we need space." I watched them load him in, my legs refusing to move. At the hospital, I paced the corridor like an animal trapped in a cage. Lisa arrived 30 minutes later. Her face went from confusion to horror the second she saw the doctor walk toward us. He didn't even have to say it. Lisa screamed, fell to her knees, and hit my chest with her fists. "What did you do? Mark, what did you do?" I didn't answer. What could I say? That the brakes failed, that it wasn't my fault, none of it mattered. Our son was gone. They let me see him one last time. The room was cold, sterile. He looked smaller somehow, like the life had been folded out of him. I touched his hand, whispering his name over and over until a nurse gently pulled me away. The police came that evening. Routine questions. They said, was I distracted? On my phone? Had I been drinking? I said no to all of it, my voice barely holding together. They took my statement, gave me a thin smile, and left. But Lisa didn't. She stood by the window, staring at the rain. "You killed him," she said quietly. "You were supposed to protect him." Her voice wasn't angry. It was hollow, like she'd already buried both of us. That night, I drove home alone. His backpack was still in the back seat, the zipper half open. Inside was his lunchbox with the sandwich he never ate. I carried it into the house, sat at the kitchen table, and just stared. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Every sound felt too loud. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I kept replaying the accident, trying to find the second where I could have changed something. If I'd left 5 minutes later, if I'd taken a different road, if I'd checked the car the night before, at 3 a.m. I walked into his room. The nightlight was still on, casting soft blue across the walls covered with posters of rockets and baseball players. His bed was unmade, the pillow dented where his head had rested. I sat down, the mattress sinking under my weight, and whispered his name. The house was silent. I could still smell his shampoo. that citrusy scent Lisa always picked for him. I pressed my hand to the blanket and broke down. The kind of crying that leaves you empty afterward. The next morning, Lisa didn't come home. She sent a text that said, "I can't be there right now." Neither could I. I stood in the doorway of Ethan's room for hours, not knowing if I should pack his things or leave them. Finally, I closed the door and leaned against it. Breathing in the quiet, the air felt heavy, like the whole house was holding its breath. That's when I realized something had broken that day. Something more than just metal and glass. I lost my son. Yes, but I also lost my wife, my family, my place in the world, and somewhere deep down, even before she said it out loud in court, I knew Lisa would never forgive me. Not for what happened. Not for surviving when he didn't. I didn't know it yet. But that was only the beginning of everything that would come after. The day of the funeral was colder than I expected for late March. The sky was that pale, washed-out blue that looks like it gave up trying to be bright. People filled the church. Faces blurred together in a fog of black coats and quiet whispers. I don't remember most of what the pastor said. Something about peace. About how Ethan was in a better place. All I could think about was how wrong that sounded. A better place would have been sitting next to me, humming along to the Wipers. Still alive. Lisa didn't look at me once. She stood stiff beside the coffin, her mother gripping her arm like she might collapse. When it was my turn to speak, my mouth went dry. I walked up to the podium, notes in my hand. But my eyes wouldn't focus on the words. I looked at the small wooden box in front of me and tried to find something to say that didn't sound like a lie. I told a story about the time Ethan and I built a model rocket together. How it exploded 10 feet off the ground, but he still clapped like we'd just reached the moon. People smiled softly. I didn't. I finished quickly and sat down. Lisa kept staring straight ahead, her jaw tight. After the burial, everyone went to Lisa's parents' house for food. Like grief could be washed down with casseroles and weak coffee. I stayed outside, standing near the line of parked cars. My brother-in-law came up beside me. He didn't say sorry or ask how I was. He just said, "You should have checked the car better." Man. Then he walked away. By the time I got home, it was dark. The house felt different now. Every sound echoed. Like the walls were hollow. I sat in the living room. Lights off. Just the TV flickering in the background with some news anchor talking about weather. I didn't listen. My phone buzzed. A message from Lisa. She wanted me to come by her lawyer's office in the morning. I already knew what it meant. At the meeting, she sat across from me, her hands folded neatly in her lap, not wearing her wedding ring. Her lawyer. A man named Peterson, with perfect hair and a voice like a voicemail. Started talking about separation and finances and assets. Lisa didn't speak until the end. She said she couldn't live with me anymore. That every time she looked at me, she saw Ethan's face. I tried to tell her it wasn't my fault. That the brakes failed. That the police said the car was defective. She didn't even blink. She said, "You're the one who chose that car. You're the one who drove him that day." It wasn't a scream or an accusation. It was worse. It was quiet and final. A week later, she filed for divorce. The next few months blurred together. I went back to work at the construction firm. But nothing felt real. My coworkers avoided me. Like grief might be contagious. I stopped going out for lunch. I stopped talking. Some nights, I'd wake up thinking I heard Ethan calling from his room, and I'd run down the hallway before remembering. One evening, after another pointless day at work, I came home to find a letter on my doorstep. It was from Lisa's lawyer again. This time it wasn't about the divorce. It was about the life insurance payout. I didn't even know there was one. $800,000. She was the beneficiary. The note said it had been processed and paid in full. $800,000. My throat tightened. I tried to ignore what that number meant. But it haunted me. I kept seeing it in my head, floating beside the image of Ethan's empty bed. I told myself it didn't matter, that no amount of money could replace him. But when Lisa bought a new house 2 months later, when she posted pictures of it online with her new boyfriend, that number burned in my mind like gasoline. People whispered. Of course. Neighbors. Friends. Even family. They said maybe she'd moved on too fast. that she'd gotten what she wanted. I didn't want to believe them. But doubt crept in like a leak under a door. The day we went to court for the custody of Ethan's belongings, Lisa didn't even look at me. She had her lawyer do all the talking. The judge ruled that since she was his mother, she could decide what to keep. I sat there, hands clasped, watching her nod while they boxed up his things. When it was over, she turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "You should have been the one who died." I didn't respond. I just stared at her, trying to find the person I used to love somewhere behind those eyes. But she was gone. After that day, I stopped answering her calls. I stopped opening mail with her name on it. I started living like a ghost in my own house. One night, I drove aimlessly until I ended up near Ethan's old school. The building was dark except for a janitor's light in one of the windows. I parked outside for a long time, just staring at the playground. The swings moved slightly in the wind, creaking like whispers. I remembered pushing him there, the way he'd laugh when I went too high. I sat there until my eyes burned, then drove home. A few weeks later, I found myself sorting through his things again. Not sure why. Maybe I wanted to punish myself. Maybe I was just looking for something that still felt like him. I opened drawers, looked under the bed, checked the closet. His baseball glove was there, his favorite book, a box of Legos. That's when I noticed a small scratch on the wooden floor, right by the edge of the bed frame. It looked like something had been dragged across it. I knelt down, pressing my fingers along the groove. There was something underneath. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it under the bed. All I could see was dust at first. And then something metallic glinted back at me. It looked like a small lockbox. I reached for it, a heart suddenly pounding. The metal was cold and covered in dust. There was a small keyhole, but no key. I sat there on the floor, the box in my lap, feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. For the first time in months, I felt something other than grief. I didn't know what was inside that box, but deep down, I knew it mattered. And I knew that whatever was locked inside might change everything I thought I knew about the day my son died. I carried the lockbox into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, my hands trembling slightly. The metal felt heavier than it should, like it was holding more than just papers or trinkets. I ran my fingers over the surface, tracing the scratches and dust patterns, thinking about the months of silence and the long nights alone. The keyhole stared back at me, small and uninviting. I didn't have a key. I didn't even know if there had ever been one. I spent the next hour pacing the living room, turning the box over and over, examining every corner for clues. My mind wandered to Lisa and the insurance money. Had she ever known about this box? Had she been after something all along? The thought made my stomach twist. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, I realized I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed a set of old tools from the garage, pliers, a small crowbar, anything that might give me leverage. The lock was stubborn, cold, and unyielding. But eventually, with careful pressure, I felt a click. The lid popped open just enough for me to see inside, and my breath caught. Inside were stacks of papers, faded photographs, and a small envelope sealed with tape. The first thing I grabbed was the envelope. It was thin, yellowed at the edges, and addressed in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I tore it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a note from Ethan, or at least it claimed to be. I blinked at the words, trying to steady my hands. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike. But the message was clear. He had written about something he had seen, something he had heard about the car and the brakes. He mentioned a man at the dealership who had been talking to my mechanic, warning about defects that could cause accidents. I felt my heart pound. Could this be true? Could someone have known the brakes were faulty and not told me? I shoved the envelope aside and began rifling through the photographs. There were pictures of Ethan with a man I didn't recognize, at a gas station, in the driveway, and at the dealership itself. My stomach dropped as I realized the dates were all before the accident. Someone had been following him, tracking him, and he had noticed. The papers were invoices, service reports, and scribbled notes in the margins. I sat on the floor, spreading everything out, trying to make sense of it. Names, numbers, dates, all connected in a web I didn't understand yet. One thing was clear. Ethan had tried to tell me something, or at least leave me a trail to find the truth. I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa might have known about this too. Had she found the box after the accident, or had she ignored it? The thought made my hands clench into fists. I needed to find out what had really happened, who was involved, and why my son had died. The next morning, I drove to the dealership. The photographs and notes spread out on the passenger seat. The building looked the same as it did months ago, clean and corporate. A showroom full of new cars that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. I walked in and asked to speak with someone in service, trying to sound casual. But the receptionist's eyes narrowed. A man named Carl came out, mid-40s, wearing a tie and a faint smirk that didn't reach his eyes. I introduced myself and mentioned the car, the accident, and my son. Carl's expression didn't change. He asked for details, jotting notes. But something about his demeanor made me uneasy. After a few minutes, I brought up Ethan's name, and Carl's pen froze. He cleared his throat and said he didn't remember anything unusual. I felt my pulse quicken. Something about his tone felt rehearsed, like he had said these words before. I showed him the photographs, the dates, the locations. His eyes flicked over them and then he smiled. A cold, tight smile. He said the pictures meant nothing, that anyone could take pictures anywhere. I could feel the anger rising, the desire to yell, to accuse him of hiding something. But I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't make a scene here. Not yet. I left the dealership with more questions than answers. The envelope and papers still clutched in my hands. The pieces were starting to fit together. But the picture was far from clear. Someone had known the brakes were faulty. Someone had followed Ethan. And now it was up to me to uncover the rest. Back at home, I spread everything out again, creating a timeline, connecting names to dates, trying to figure out who could have had the motive to watch my son. I noticed a recurring name, one that appeared in the notes and on some of the service reports, a name I had never paid attention to before. I grabbed the phone, ready to start digging, ready to confront whoever had been involved. And I realized I wasn't just looking for answers anymore. I was looking for justice, for some form of closure. And deep down, I knew it wouldn't be simple. The house felt colder than usual that night. I sat in the living room, the lockbox open beside me, staring at the pile of evidence. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of purpose, a direction to focus my grief. Whatever the next step was, I knew I couldn't go back. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed longer, heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And I understood that finding the truth would not just bring answers, it would bring danger, confrontation, and the possibility of revenge. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what had to come next. Then, I closed the living room door, leaving the lockbox on the floor, and walked into the kitchen to make a cup of coffee. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. But in that quiet, I could already feel the storm brewing. I stared at the lockbox one last time before grabbing my coat and heading out the door. The air outside was crisp, the kind of autumn chill that made every breath feel sharp and alive. I had a list of names and dates scribbled on a pad, and my mind ran over every connection, every potential lead. Whoever had been involved in Ethan's accident had left traces, and I was determined to follow them. The first call I made was to a private investigator I had met years ago, someone I trusted to dig without alerting the wrong people. His name was Frank, early 50s, a former police officer with a knack for finding things others overlooked. I gave him a brief overview, careful not to reveal everything, and he agreed to start digging into the dealership and the people I had identified from the lockbox. While waiting for him to report back, I drove around the neighborhoods Ethan used to frequent, trying to piece together the timeline from his perspective. The gas station where one of the photos was taken looked unchanged. The same faded signage, the same old pump. I remembered seeing Ethan there with a friend once, talking and laughing, and the memory twisted my chest. The joy in those photos was gone now, replaced by suspicion and fear. At home, I spread the photographs and papers across the kitchen table, analyzing each one. There was a man who appeared repeatedly, someone I hadn't recognized at first glance. I called around, asking questions without revealing too much. No one seemed to know him. But something about the way he appeared in the photos made me certain he was involved. Days passed, and Frank started sending updates. He had dug into employee records, surveillance footage, and service logs. There were gaps, missing files, and inconsistencies that made my stomach churn. One employee, a young mechanic named Ryan, had left the dealership abruptly a month before the accident. His exit wasn't on record officially, and Frank suspected he knew something. I decided to visit Ryan. His apartment was in a rundown complex on the edge of town, a stark contrast to the polished showroom of the dealership. I knocked, and he answered, cautious but not surprised to see me. His eyes flicked to the papers in my hands. We sat at his small kitchen table, and I asked him about Ethan, about the day of the accident, and about the brakes. He hesitated, then spoke slowly, almost as if testing the waters. He admitted he had warned someone at the dealership about a potential issue with the brake lines, that the parts were faulty and could fail under stress. He didn't know if it had been fixed. He also mentioned seeing a man in a dark suit taking photos around the dealership and making calls. My pulse raced. Everything was connecting, pieces snapping into place. Yet the full picture remained elusive. I asked Ryan if he had any proof, and he handed me a small envelope, worn at the edges, containing text messages and photos he had saved on his phone. The messages were between him and an unknown contact, discussing the brakes and a potential cover-up. Leaving Ryan's apartment, I felt the weight of what I was holding. These weren't just pieces of evidence. They were breadcrumbs leading me toward a truth that someone had tried to bury. My anger flared, hot and raw, as I thought of Lisa and her calm acceptance of the insurance money. Had she known about any of this? Had she been part of the deception or just blind to it? Back home, I compared the messages with the papers from the lockbox. Patterns emerged. Names, dates, locations that overlapped. There was a recurring mention of a corporate figure, someone high enough to influence decisions at the dealership and ensure that faulty brakes remained unnoticed. I realized then that I needed more than just Frank's digging and Ryan's reluctant cooperation. I needed to confront people directly, find out who was behind the photos, who had known the truth, and who had allowed it to happen. I knew it would be dangerous. The higher up I went, the more risk there would be. But the thought of stopping, of letting this fade into silence, was unbearable. That night, I sat on the porch, the cool wind tugging at my jacket. The evidence was laid out in front of me. My thoughts a tangled mess of anger, grief, and determination. I remembered Ethan's smile, his excitement over small things, the way he trusted people instinctively. The idea that someone had exploited that trust made my hands clench, and I felt a resolve harden inside me. I knew the next steps would test me in ways I hadn't imagined. Confrontations, lies, hidden agendas. I would have to be careful, methodical, but unyielding. Someone had to answer for what happened, and I was not walking away until I found them. The clock ticked past midnight, and the neighborhood lay silent. I sipped a cup of coffee, my eyes on the papers still spread across the table. Each name, each date, each photo was a thread leading to the heart of the truth, and I knew that following these threads would take me deeper into a world I hadn't been prepared for. A world of betrayal, hidden motives, and cold calculations. I went to bed with a plan forming, a quiet determination to follow every lead, confront every suspect, and uncover the full story behind the accident that had taken Ethan from me. The storm was coming, and I had to be ready. Morning came with a gray sky pressing down over the city, and I couldn't shake the restless energy that had taken hold overnight. I had mapped out the leads I needed to follow, each one connected to the names in Ryan's messages and the documents from the lockbox. My first stop was the corporate office of Hawthorne Automotive, a sleek building in downtown Chicago, where I knew the higher-ups were hiding behind polished glass and cold suits. I parked a block away and walked in, blending with the early morning crowd of employees and delivery men. The receptionist gave me a cursory glance, and I lied that I had an appointment with Michael Reynolds. The vice president of operations. She nodded, picked up the phone, and asked him to meet me. I waited in the lobby, fingers tapping against my briefcase, mind running through every question I needed answers for. When Michael finally appeared, he was everything you'd expect from someone in his position. Mid-40s, impeccably dressed, confident in a way that made people uneasy. He didn't smile, only gestured for me to follow him to a small conference room. I set the tone immediately, introducing myself as Ethan's father and explaining that I had questions about his accident and the circumstances around it. He shifted in his chair, leaning back slightly, as if trying to measure my resolve. His voice was calm but cold when he spoke, asking what exactly I wanted to know. I laid out the facts I had, carefully observing his reactions. When I mentioned the brake lines and the warnings Ryan had given, I saw a flicker of something nervousness, maybe fear before he composed himself. He denied knowledge, claimed he had no reason to believe any parts were faulty, but I could see the cracks in his story, the hesitation in his voice, the way he avoided eye contact when I mentioned the photos. I pressed further, asking about the emails between employees and management. He deflected, mentioning confidentiality policies and legal restrictions. After leaving the office, my head was spinning. I had come seeking answers, and found only a wall of polished lies. I drove to a small diner near the river, trying to clear my thoughts over a cup of bitter coffee. The city moved around me, oblivious to the storm brewing in my life. I went over the evidence in my head, piecing together the timeline, trying to figure out who else could corroborate Ryan's story. Frank called just as I was leaving the diner. He had uncovered more. The man in the dark suit, he said, was a corporate investigator named Alan Prescott, known for handling sensitive cases discreetly. Prescott had been seen at the dealership multiple times, asking questions and observing staff. Frank suspected he was covering up the incident rather than investigating it. I knew then that the scope of this went far beyond a single faulty brake line. There was a network of people ensuring that the truth never saw the light of day. I felt the anger rise again, hotter this time, fueled by the realization that Ethan's death had been preventable and that powerful people were actively working to erase any trace of their negligence. That evening, I met with Ryan again, this time in a quieter location, a small park where no one would recognize us. We went over the messages and photos again, marking the patterns and potential connections. Ryan's hands shook as he pointed out the names of higher-level employees who had been involved in approving substandard parts and ignoring warnings. He admitted he had feared for his own career, that speaking out could cost him everything. But now he realized he couldn't stay silent. The conversation shifted toward strategy. I had to be careful, methodical, but unrelenting. We discussed ways to gather additional evidence, contacts who might have been in the loop, and the timing of events that could be verified. Every step had to be calculated. One wrong move could tip them off and erase the trail entirely. Driving home that night, the city lights blurred past as I thought about the family I had lost and the man I was confronting. I kept picturing Ethan's face, his laughter, his endless questions about the world. I promised myself I would uncover every lie, expose every secret, and ensure justice was served, not out of vengeance alone, but because it was the right thing to do for him. At home, I spread the materials across the living room floor again, connecting names and dates, noting discrepancies and points of interest. My phone buzzed with another update from Frank, confirming that Prescott had a history of covering up accidents and threatening whistleblowers. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just negligence, it was deliberate obstruction. And now I was caught in the middle of a dangerous game. I sat back in my chair, rubbing my temples, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. I had leads, but I had to move carefully. Every confrontation, every visit, every question asked at the wrong time could backfire. And yet, I couldn't stop. The answers were out there, hidden behind lies and bureaucracy, waiting to be uncovered. I knew that the next steps would take me deeper into the corporate machinery, into people who protected their own interests at all costs. But I also knew that each step brought me closer to understanding the full truth. The path ahead was fraught with risk, but the alternative, walking away, was unthinkable. By the time I finally went to bed, My mind was restless but focused. I reviewed the strategy one last time, going over names, locations, potential witnesses, and the gaps I still needed to fill. Tomorrow would be another day of confrontation, of digging deeper into a system designed to hide the truth. And I was ready to face it head on, because there was no turning back now. The next morning, I woke to the low hum of the city outside my apartment and the faint smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. I didn't want to sleep anymore. Not when there was so much to do. So many loose threads to follow. I grabbed my laptop and began going over the files Ryan had sent me, cross-referencing dates, emails, and employee records. Patterns were emerging, subtle at first, but undeniable once you noticed them. One name kept appearing: Leonard Hayes, the head of quality assurance at Hawthorne Automotive. His involvement wasn't direct in the accident, but his approvals, his signature on reports, and the internal memos suggested he had turned a blind eye to warnings. I remembered Ryan mentioning him nervously, whispering about threats and intimidation from higher-ups. Hayes was a man who played safe and protected his own, and now he was a crucial link in the chain. I decided to visit the small workshop in Oakbrook, where some of the faulty parts had originated. The streets were quieter here, older buildings casting long shadows in the morning light. I parked and walked inside, greeted by the familiar smell of oil and machinery. The foreman, a grizzled man named Tom Daniels, recognized me immediately, though he tried to hide it behind a neutral expression. I told him I was following up on Ethan's case, and he hesitated. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the fear of getting involved and the weight of conscience pressing on him. After a long pause, he quietly admitted that he had noticed issues with the brake components months before the accident. He had raised concerns to Hayes but was told to ignore them or risk losing his job. The conversation took a tense turn when Tom mentioned Prescott again. The corporate investigator. Prescott had been around, questioning employees and subtly intimidating anyone who asked too many questions. Tom had kept his head down, but the guilt was evident in his voice. He handed me a folder with internal memos, notes, and emails, quietly saying he hoped this would help me find the truth. Leaving the workshop, I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Finally, I had concrete evidence, yet the scope of deception was larger than I had imagined. Driving back to the city, I thought about the legal and social consequences if this all went public. Prescott and Hayes were just the beginning. There were layers of protection, people willing to lie, threaten, or manipulate to keep their secrets hidden. Back in my apartment, Ryan joined me once more, reviewing the new documents. His eyes widened as we mapped out Hayes' involvement, connecting him to other executives and suppliers. The realization hit hard: this wasn't a simple negligence case. It was systemic corruption with lives at stake. We discussed strategies carefully, weighing risks against potential breakthroughs. Every step had to be deliberate. Exposing one piece too early could trigger a defensive wave that would bury the truth even deeper. Later that afternoon, I visited Ethan's old apartment. Being there brought a visceral reminder of what I had lost, the emptiness palpable in every corner. I went through his belongings, finding little traces of his life, each one a silent accusation. Under his bed, I found a small notebook, scribbled with dates, names, and notes about school projects and friends. Among the mundane entries was a note about a visit to the dealership with a teacher's recommendation for a science fair project. It wasn't directly related, but it reminded me that he had been meticulous, curious, and observant. As the day faded, I met with Frank at a small cafe to go over the next steps. He had gathered intel on Prescott, tracking his movements and his contacts within the corporate world. Every detail pointed to a man skilled at covering tracks, manipulating narratives, and intimidating witnesses. We discussed how to approach Hayes without alerting Prescott, and how to ensure that any statements collected could stand up to scrutiny. I returned home as dusk fell over Chicago, the skyline darkening, but the streets still alive with activity. I spread the evidence across my living room floor, feeling the enormity of what we were up against. There was no turning back. The risk had escalated, but so had the urgency. I had to be methodical, patient, and relentless. Late into the night, I sat in silence, reviewing the connections we had uncovered. The files revealed a chain of decisions made to prioritize profit over safety. A cascade of small compromises that led to a tragic outcome. I thought about the families affected, the lives endangered, and the system that allowed it to happen. Anger simmered beneath the surface. But alongside it was a clarity of purpose. By the time I finally allowed myself to rest, I had a plan forming. Each step carefully plotted, each move calculated to expose the truth without triggering a premature backlash. The road ahead was dangerous. But now I had direction. The next day would require confrontation, courage, and precision. The investigation was no longer abstract. It had become personal. And every decision carried the weight of Ethan's memory. As I turned off the lights, I felt the tension coiling in my chest, a constant reminder that nothing could be left to chance. The stakes were higher than ever, and the path to justice would demand everything I had. The next morning, I woke to a sense of urgency that was impossible to ignore. Chicago was bustling, but the weight of what lay ahead made everything outside my apartment feel muted. I had to confront Hayes, but I knew going in blindly would be a mistake. I spent hours reviewing every email, memo, and note we had gathered, committing details to memory and tracing the web of connections that pointed back to him. By mid-morning, I drove to Hawthorne Automotive, a nondescript building tucked into an industrial section of the city. The parking lot was nearly empty, which was fortunate. I slipped through the side entrance and made my way to Hayes's office, trying to remain calm despite the tight knot of anxiety in my chest. The receptionist looked up as I entered. Surprised to see me, I introduced myself casually, saying I had some follow-up questions regarding a supplier audit. She hesitated but eventually directed me to Hayes's office, warning me that he was in a meeting. I waited outside the office, pacing silently, rehearsing what I would say, weighing every possible response. After what felt like an eternity, Hayes finally emerged, a man in his mid-50s with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze. His expression flickered briefly, a shadow of recognition, before settling into professional detachment. I introduced myself as someone looking into the brake component issues, framing it as routine due diligence. Hayes nodded, but I could see the tension beneath his composed exterior. We exchanged pleasantries, but I quickly steered the conversation toward the emails, memos, and the discrepancies in the reports. Hayes stiffened, and I could feel the atmosphere tighten, the polite veneer cracking. He tried to deflect, speaking about process improvements and external audits, but I pressed on gently, letting him know I was aware of the warnings Tom Daniels had submitted. Hayes hesitated, shifting uncomfortably, and I seized the moment to ask about Prescott. His eyes flickered, and I could tell he had not anticipated that line of questioning. Hayes's voice dropped as he admitted that Prescott had been pressuring him for months, subtly threatening his position, implying consequences for any employee who did not comply with corporate directives. I listened carefully, asking about specific incidents, dates, and the actions he had taken. His defenses slowly crumbled, revealing small but crucial details that painted a larger picture of systemic negligence and intimidation. After the meeting, I left Hawthorne Automotive with a folder containing Hayes's handwritten notes, emails, and clarifications. Each document added another piece to the puzzle, another layer of accountability. Driving back to the city, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly, replaced by a renewed focus. The evidence was solidifying, and I could see the path forward with greater clarity. Back at my apartment, Ryan and I spread out the new materials on the table, mapping out connections between Hayes, Prescott, and other executives. Every revelation brought a mixture of satisfaction and unease. We were unearthing truths that powerful people had worked to conceal for years. But the stakes had never been higher. A misstep could jeopardize the entire investigation. Yet withholding what we now knew felt impossible. That evening, I called Sarah, Ethan's mother. Though our conversations were brief and strained, she had moved on in her own way, trying to shield herself from the grief that still consumed me. I kept the details of Hayes and Prescott from her, unwilling to burden her further. But I felt the need to hear her voice, to anchor myself in the memory of our shared loss. She spoke softly about daily routines, about Ethan's favorite places and habits, and I listened, holding on to the remnants of normalcy even as my world revolved around uncovering corporate deceit. Later, I revisited the folder Tom Daniels had given me, combing through the memos with fresh eyes. I noticed inconsistencies in dates and approvals, subtle gaps that suggested other employees might have been coerced or bribed to overlook defects. This realization led me to consider the broader network of individuals who might be involved, and the possibility of uncovering more witnesses who could corroborate Hayes's revelations. The night grew deep, and the city's hum quieted, but I remained at the table, piecing together the timeline. Each connection, each memo, each recollection from Tom and Hayes painted a more vivid picture of what had truly transpired. It was no longer just about a single accident. It was about exposing a culture of negligence and intimidation that had put countless lives at risk. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted yet driven, knowing the coming days would demand confrontation, persistence, and strategy. Hayes's admission had opened a door, but it was only the first step. The trail led further, toward Prescott, toward upper management, and toward the systems that allowed such recklessness to persist. Before closing the apartment door for the night, I looked at Ethan's notebook lying on the coffee table. The pages, filled with meticulous notes and small reminders of a life abruptly taken, reminded me why I could not falter. The pursuit of justice was no longer abstract. It was personal, intimate, and necessary. I turned off the lights and allowed a few hours of restless sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring another round of careful investigation, calculated moves, and the persistent tension of walking through a world where the wrong people held all the power. The path forward was clear in my mind, and the first real cracks in the facade of corporate protection had begun to show. The next morning, I returned to the office with a sense of resolve that left no room for hesitation. The stack of documents from Hayes and Tom lay neatly on my desk, and I spent the first hour reviewing them again, cross-referencing dates, names, and internal communications. Something in the way Prescott had maneuvered through the chain of command suggested he had a broader network of allies, and I needed to identify them before making any moves. By mid-morning, I arranged a meeting with two former engineers who had resigned quietly over the past year, meeting them in a neutral cafe near the Loop. I could sense their initial hesitation. They were protective of their reputations, wary of speaking out against powerful executives, but I reassured them that their input could expose a pattern of negligence without immediately putting them in the spotlight. They shared stories of pressures to overlook minor defects, of meetings where Prescott would subtly imply consequences for those who challenged his directives, and of times when internal audits were conveniently ignored. As they spoke, I scribbled notes furiously, connecting their accounts to Hayes's admissions and the memos I had already compiled. Each piece reinforced the narrative I was building, revealing the depth of systematic disregard for safety. After the meeting, I walked back to my car through the busy streets, a mix of adrenaline and unease coursing through me. The city seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of manipulation and risk that had been hidden behind corporate doors. I realized that bringing the story to light would not just be about presenting facts but also about understanding the human impact of these actions. Returning to the apartment, I found Ryan waiting with updates from an anonymous whistleblower who had contacted him via encrypted email. The information suggested Prescott had been funneling bonuses and incentives to managers who turned a blind eye, further demonstrating a pattern of corruption. I felt a chill as I read through the documents. The network was larger than I had imagined, and the stakes higher. We spent hours connecting dots on a large whiteboard, drawing lines between executives, managers, and the specific incidents that had led to accidents or near misses. The visualization clarified the scope of the problem, showing a tangled web of responsibility that extended far beyond a single department. Every time we added another name or memo, the picture became clearer, but also more daunting. That evening, I decided to confront Prescott directly. I scheduled a casual lunch under the pretense of discussing operational efficiency. He arrived at the restaurant with his usual confidence, shaking my hand warmly. unaware of the extent of the information I had compiled. We sat in a quiet corner, and I initiated small talk, letting the tension build subtly before steering the conversation toward the audits and employee reports. Prescott's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. His eyes narrowed, and his casual smile became taut. I mentioned Hayes's recent clarifications and the whistleblower information. Watching him process the implications, I asked pointed questions about his involvement in the decisions that led to overlooked defects. Observing his hesitation and carefully chosen words, he tried to maintain control of the narrative, insisting that procedures were followed and any oversights were isolated incidents. I pressed further, detailing specific cases and the chain of emails showing approvals or ignored warnings. His facade cracked slightly, and I noticed a subtle tremor in his hand as he sipped his coffee. The veneer of authority was fading, and I sensed he realized I was no longer an ordinary investigator, but someone who had pieced together enough evidence to challenge him. After lunch, I returned to the apartment feeling a mix of triumph and caution. I knew Prescott's reaction was significant, but it also confirmed that there was more work to be done to uncover the full extent of the network and ensure accountability. We spent the rest of the evening organizing the evidence, preparing for the next steps that would involve legal consultation and potentially contacting regulators. As night fell, the city lights flickered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. I leaned back, reflecting on how far we had come since the accident. Every document, every conversation, every reluctant confession from insiders was a step toward exposing the truth. But I also knew that Prescott and his allies would not surrender easily. The path ahead required patience, precision, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable realities. Before turning in for the night, I glanced at Ethan's notebook on the coffee table. The pages were filled with sketches and reminders of a life interrupted, a constant reminder of why this pursuit mattered. It was not just about corporate accountability. It was about ensuring that no one else suffered from negligence that could have been prevented. I turned off the lights and sat in the darkness for a few minutes, letting the weight of the day settle. The investigation was gaining momentum, but the tension was palpable. Tomorrow would demand another round of strategic moves, interviews, and careful observation. I knew that each decision carried consequences, yet the drive to seek justice propelled me forward. The following morning, I arrived at the courthouse with a mixture of anxiety and determination. The case against Prescott and his network had grown to a scale none of us had anticipated, but the evidence was undeniable. As I walked through the marble halls, the weight of the previous months pressed against me, each step a reminder of how much had been sacrificed to reach this point. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Reporters lined the gallery, taking notes and capturing photographs, and a murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd as Prescott entered. He carried himself with the same polished confidence, but there was a subtle tension in his posture, a recognition that his usual control over situations was slipping. As the proceedings began, the testimonies unfolded with precision. Hayes recounted the internal meetings, naming names and confirming the patterns of negligence. The engineers I had met months ago spoke with caution but clarity, their words painting a stark picture of systemic failures. Each statement added weight to the narrative, creating an almost tangible sense of accountability pressing down on Prescott. I watched Prescott closely throughout, noting every shift in expression, every pause that betrayed unease. He tried to deflect and rationalize, but the evidence we had gathered was meticulous, leaving little room for manipulation. The legal team presented emails, memos, and internal reports, tracing decisions that had endangered lives, and the room seemed to hold its breath with each revelation. During a recess, I stepped outside to clear my mind. The sun was bright against the stone of the courthouse, a stark contrast to the tension inside. I reflected on the journey from that first day, when I discovered the initial reports and felt a surge of frustration and helplessness, to this moment where truth and accountability were finally converging. The path had been exhausting, emotionally draining, and fraught with uncertainty. Yet the persistence of evidence and the courage of those who spoke out had brought us here. Returning to the courtroom, the final arguments were made. The prosecutor summarized the evidence with an intensity that left no room for doubt. emphasizing the human cost of the negligence. Prescott's defense tried to mitigate responsibility, highlighting isolated incidents and procedural technicalities. But the narrative we had built was comprehensive and unyielding. When the jury began deliberations, I felt a cautious optimism. Weeks of preparation, meticulous documentation, and countless conversations had led to this moment. The verdict, when it came, was decisive. Prescott and the key members of his network were found accountable. Their attempts to evade responsibility dismantled by the weight of truth. Relief and vindication washed over me, tempered by the sobering knowledge of how close disaster had come and the lives affected along the way. Leaving the courthouse, the crisp autumn air felt different somehow, lighter. The city moved around me with its usual rhythm, but I felt a sense of closure, a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. The months of investigation, the painstaking collection of evidence, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths had yielded results. Lives would be safer because of the actions taken, and that mattered more than any personal satisfaction. Back at my apartment, I gathered the files one last time, organizing them into a clear archive. This documentation was not just a record of events, but a testament to perseverance and accountability. I glanced at Ethan's notebook, still filled with reminders of the life that had been altered, and I felt a solemn resolve to continue protecting and advocating for safety and integrity wherever possible. As the evening settled, I reflected on the lessons learned. Patience, attention to detail, and unwavering commitment to truth had carried me through the most challenging months of my life. I realized that while revenge had fueled my determination, the ultimate goal had always been justice and prevention, ensuring no one else suffered from the same negligence. I poured a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the dark skyline. The sense of accomplishment was profound, yet tempered by humility and respect for the people who had contributed, often quietly, to this outcome. Each small action, each courageous confession, had been a thread woven into the larger tapestry of accountability. Before turning in for the night, I made a note to reach out to those who had supported the investigation, to thank them for their bravery and dedication. This journey had been about more than exposing wrongdoing. It had been about restoring integrity and trust where it had been eroded. As I closed the notebook and looked out over the city, I felt a quiet satisfaction, a completion of a chapter that had begun with shock and despair, but had ended with clarity and justice. For anyone following this story, remember that standing up for truth is never easy, but it can change lives and hold those responsible accountable. If you want to hear more stories of persistence, resilience, and the pursuit of justice, stay connected and follow along, because every story has lessons worth sharing.